Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
We are in Parashat Kedoshim this morning, and I know that we generally stay pretty true to the triennial reading. However, in this case, it doesn't really make that big of a difference because it's a collection of laws. And so let's just kind of get a feel for that, and let's look at chapter 19, verse 13, and we'll move into our last third of the parsha. 19:13, you shall not, exactly. Robert, would you like to read?
You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. You shall not insult the deaf, or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am Adonai. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kin fairly. Do not deal basely with members of your people. And profit by the blood of your fellow Israelite. I am Adonai. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow Israelite as yourself. I am Adonai. You shall observe my laws. You shall not let your cattle mate with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. You shall not put on cloth for a mixture of two kinds of material. If a man has carnal relations with a woman who is a slave and has been designated for another man but has not been redeemed or given her freedom, there shall be an indemnity. They shall not, however, be put to death since she has not been freed. But he must bring to the entrance of the tent of meeting as his reparation offering to Adonai a ram of reparation offering. With the ram of reparation offering, the priest shall make expiation for him before Adonai for the sin that he committed, and the sin that he committed will be forgiven him. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden for you, not to be eaten. In the 4th year, its fruit shall be set aside for jubilation before Adonai. And only in the 5th year may you use its fruit, that its yield to you may be increased. I am Adonai, am your God. You shall not eat anything with its blood. You shall not practice divination or soothsaying. You, men, shall not round off the side growth on your head or destroy the side growth of your beard. You shall not make gashes in your flesh for the dead or incise any marks on yourselves. I am Adonai. Do not degrade your daughter and make her a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry and the land be filled with depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and venerate my sanctuary. I am Adonai.
Okay. So we're getting a sense here of what Kedoshim is about. So you get a sense of the breadth of the laws here. When we talk about Leviticus, we're talking about what source? What's the source for this material? The priests. What are our other sources? Tell me the sources in the documentary hypothesis. What are the sources of Torah?
Moses.
Oy vey.
There are 4, but I can't remember the names of them.
All right. So we have J, E, P, and D.
Yeah.
The Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly author, and the Deuteronomist. These are our sources. Some scholars, in studying this material, want to break out now some different sources within these. And the one we're dealing with is the priestly source. So we have the rest of the book of Leviticus, and then we have this that we're in now, which is known as, in biblical study, it's known as the Holiness Code. There are scholars who now tell us sources are J, E, P, H, and D. So what we're dealing with is who is H. So we talked last week and the week before at great length about the priestly agenda. And we talked a lot about the priestly worldview and how we get this kind of categorizing, right, of life, of creatures, of behavior, and that it's very important to the priestly writers because what we're dealing with is a need to stay ordered because the opposite of order is disorder, which is chaos. And chaos is the coming apart of reality as we know it. So they are very interested in keeping things orderly so that chaos does not reign and so that things go well with humanity and the planet and all of that. All right, so we know that that's P. This is different than what we see in P. There's some of traditional P in here. What are some of the things you heard that we talked about the last few weeks that sound like the traditional P?
The reparation offering.
We got an offering. When something goes wrong, we have to have a way to correct it. What else is P interested in?
Do not eat anything with blood.
Do not eat anything with blood. Correct. And what about this business of cattle mating with different kinds? Not sowing a field with two kinds of seed. Not wearing clothes that are made from two kinds of materials. This is all that stuff that makes them really hinky and really nervous is mixing stuff that's going to lead to more mixing, which is going to lead to, oh my God, right? Dancing. Which could lead to dancing. Exactly right. It leads to dancing. So that is all very much P. But we have other stuff here that does not sound like our traditional P. Do not defraud your fellow. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. What is that? What is that about? You have to pay day laborers right away. Why? Because they're poor. They're vulnerable. And as Reuben says and as Sarah says, that way they're sure to get it. And they depend on it in order to buy food for the morning for their family, right?
He mustn't leave, you would have to give him back his cloak.
That's right. If you take a cloak from somebody, which was their outer garment, which is their sleeping bag, if you take it from them as a pledge, you have to give it back to them at night so that they have something to protect them and something to sleep in. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. This does not sound like traditional P. So these things are coming to us from this source, and there are many people who want to associate H with not the priests, but the prophets. That the early prophets, we know, we've talked about the priestly worldview. Talk to me about what the prophets are about. We have priests and we have the early prophets. What's going on with those groups?
Yeah, so it's the morality to be kind to each other, to be more responsible to your neighbor.
Who's saying that?
The prophet.
The prophets. The prophets are saying, it's all lovely that you priests are keeping everything going in the temple. It's very lovely that you all do the sacrifices exactly the right way, and the incense offering exactly the right way, and that we Israelites know exactly what offering we have to bring when we screw up, and when we mess up this way, we have to bring that's all well and good. But it doesn't talk about character. It doesn't talk about relationships between people.
It's hard to imagine the prophets before basically the Torah. The
Right.
prophets are later on.
Right. We think of the prophets as later, don't we? So this is a correction for us, because the prophets do come later in our canon, right, as we look at the order of the books of Torah. Torah writ large, right, which means all of our sacred writings that have been canonized. They appear later in the lineup, but we suspect that the influence of the very early prophets is felt already in P, in Leviticus. That they are responding to the criticism, and I don't mean criticism, we now hear criticism as bad, right? I don't mean that. They are responding to the critique of the biblical Israelite cult system that says, is that all that's important? You can hear Isaiah in this. Is this the fast I want? Right? Is this is what you think I want, says God in the character God in Isaiah? That I want you all to fast and it's so hard for you while people are starving in your communities? I don't care about your fast on Yom Kippur if you can't live lives that are expressive of holiness. Kedoshim to you. So the whole business here is about Kedusha. The holiness code is about Kedusha. Right? Holiness.
What is this holiness code? Something that you know about?
Leviticus 19 is the holiness code.
Okay.
That is what this is called in biblical parlance, in biblical scholarship. You're getting a master's level education here, Reuben. This is the holiness code. And hence, the source being H for holiness. So, it's not that the priestly authors are unaware of Kedusha, of holiness. They're not unaware of it. But talk to me a little bit, and there's no right or wrong answer, but talk to me about how the priestly source generally understands Kedusha. It's not easy. It's not an easy question. But how does the priestly world understand Kedusha, holiness?
It's ritualistic.
It's ritualistic in that ritual can facilitate our ability to get close to Kedusha because it alleviates, it washes away the contamination that keeps us from Kedusha.
You're just interested in keeping things orderly.
Keeping things orderly. So what is Kedusha in that system?
It depends on routine in a way.
It depends on routine.
They oversee that.
Right.
Whereas the prophets are seeing a broader range of things because they're out there with the people.
So Sarah's touching on a very important point. Kedusha to the priests is a little bit like, I'm going to see if this metaphor works, a little bit like electricity. They are very good electricians. Right? They're very good about knowing which wire you touch to which wire so that you don't get blown across the room. Right? They know how to ground, right? They know how to make sure light happens because they have mitigated this force called electricity. They have the instruments and the ability and the knowledge to know how to work with it so that things go well. H, or the prophets, understand something else. They're with the people, as Sarah said. They are concerned about human beings' relationships with each other and relationships within and between communities that are expressive of the good things about electricity. So
The prophets are the users of the electricity, to use your metaphor.
So they are using electricity, and they're like, the electricity comes on is one thing. What are we going to do with it? It might be, if electricity is Kedusha, then the energy that flows between us, when things are good and I'm kind to you, and you are generous and compassionate to me, that energy is the energy that the prophets are concerned with. Not the one that just turns on the lights. Right? A static force that's out there that kind of just exists, and we manipulate it with, as you said, procedures and processes and behaviors about ritual. That's okay, that's fine. But if that's all that's happening, the prophets say, that's not the point of energy. The point of energy is that the way I treat you, that energy that comes at you, affects you. And then it affects how you respond to me. And we can either get a lot of good energy going here, or people are suffering and miserable, and that is a lack of godliness.
But in one sense, the priests supplant
the Levites. Once the temple's gone. In the sense, what the Levites were about and what sacrifice was all about is, you have these extremely fixed procedures that are never adapted. In other words, that's what it says. This is what we do. Once the temple's gone and the priests take over, or the rabbinic tradition takes over, yes, they are, the priestly tradition will have it be ritualistic, but now it's words and formulas and things like that. But the influence of the prophets is to give cover to the priests to become adaptive and reconstructive in their own way.
Here?
Not in Leviticus. Not in Leviticus.
Because I think that's exactly what's happening. I think you just nailed it right on the head. What's happening here is the prophets are pushing.
We're seeing the influence of the prophets in the text here from the priests, in the sense that to the extent that the portions that are being written in the 5th and 6th centuries, which is several hundred years after the Levites, it says, it's basically, okay, we're going to have these words in place of sacrifices, but the words don't have to be exactly, as rigid as the sacrificial formulas were. We get to take account of what's going on in the world.
Okay, so hold that, because I want to bring that question back when we talk about now.
Now.
How rigid have those words and those rituals put in place by those critics, have they become the new rigidity that if you don't do it, you're not Yotze, you haven't davened the morning Shachrit. So I want to hold that. I do believe that they are pushing the priests to reconstruct their own approach to Kedusha, and that's what we see here in the Holiness Code. Mickey?
In Micah, the people are clamoring, what does God really want from us with all this ritual and all that? What does it all mean? And Micah answers, to do justly, do the right thing, be merciful, have compassion with your fellow man, and
walk humbly.
Humble.
Walk humbly with your God.
Yeah, you're not such a big shot. $400,000 a year, you're not such a big shot.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, it just, for me, what resonates is that, like when I think about Yom Kippur, we have the high holidays. We have a melody that maybe Chaim would sing that brings me to this place of being able to think about like what's holy, or everybody individually. And it's like, what do you do with that space and that time? Like, it gives it a vessel in order to be able to get to the holiness, at least for that moment, or to be thinking about whatever that is.
So this goes to that point I was talking about earlier, that Kedusha is either has been an out there static force in Leviticus. With the Holiness Code, we see something new. We see it being a dynamic force that is expressed through people's behavior, which is dependent on how we use our time. So you mentioned an important concept that enters in here and continues to enter Jewish life in a different way, which is, how do we spend our time? And that can be expressive of Kedusha or not. That is a new idea, right? That is a very important turning point, and is what allows Jewish life to continue after the priesthood crumbles. George?
Yes, with all the things and about humanity and loving, the one that struck me is that you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt for their actions. And with the kid, I have one kid who has made very bad decisions, and of course I feel guilty. This says I shouldn't feel guilty.
No.
It doesn't say that.
No.
Okay.
No. So, no.
Yeah, it doesn't say that. I loved it.
I know, you loved it. I hate to take it away from you. Lo tisne et achicha bilvavecha. You shouldn't hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You are obligated to rebuke a member of your people, but not to the point where you now have a sin. If I see you doing something that is shameful, it is my obligation to say, George, I saw how you spoke to Leela, and it's not okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I shouldn't do it in a way that I'm now committing a sin by embarrassing you publicly. If I call you out publicly, right now, I'm causing damage to you that makes me guilty. Guilt here is not a feeling. Guilt is you're innocent or you're guilty of an infraction.
Yes, now see, because of my own needs, I interpret it differently.
That's all right. That's all right. All right.
It makes you feel better.
Father, it's not like you're talking about somebody across the room who you're not related to. I mean,
Right, so we could have a whole conversation about our children's behavior and what that means for us and what we feel and all that. That would be a very fascinating conversation. Torah is not interested in that conversation. Torah doesn't care what we feel other than don't feel what? Hatred. That, right? Don't hate in your heart. And again, it's not really a feeling. Torah doesn't, you can't legislate feelings. So Torah is saying, don't go there. Right? When it comes up, don't go there. You gotta fight going to hating people in your community. You have to. But whenever Torah is talking about guilt, it's talking about actual being found guilty. Not feeling guilty. And you're gonna get me off onto my thing, George. Now you did it. And I argue all the time, based on a teaching of a very wise teacher, that guilt is not a feeling. Guilt isn't a feeling. Guilt is a judgment. I should do X, but I did Y. Guilt is not a feeling. We say I feel guilty. Guilt is not a feeling. We feel sad. Guilt is a judgment. Guilt is about this. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't use this, and I'm not saying we shouldn't say we should do X and I didn't, and then we'll deal with that at Yom Kippur and other times where there's ways for tshuva. But it's not a feeling. It's not an emotion. The emotion, is I feel sad.
I may also be a personal interpretation, but I hear what you're saying about assess what's happened. It exists for that way, and I see that they're talking about guilt and also holding grudges. And I feel like it's like, don't feel guilty, don't hold a grudge. Reprove who you can if it's necessary and move on. Right? So.
But feel guilty if you feel a grudge.
Correct.
So, moving a little bit off the guilty thing, but maybe it's related. It seems to me that in sort of modernity, in the Jewish world, that we've sort of flipped things. Because one might argue that, the priestly way of being holy in today's age as a Jew is, you show up once a year for Yom Kippur, right? You get your kids bar bat mitzvah, right? You occasionally come to service, and you know what? You're a Jew, you're being holy, and that's sort of a ritualistic type of way to have a Jewish identity and arguably feel holy. When the flip side is that holiness is really in your day-to-day actions, everything you do when you wake up, how you act throughout the day, with your family and your business life and all of that. And there was just one short piece of commentary in this book that sort of spoke to me on that, because it said that the phrase, "you shall be holy," has been understood by some not as a command, but as a promise. Live by these rules, and your life will become special in the process. Your fundamental need for significance, for the assurance that your life has meaning, will thereby be met. So really, for me, that's why many times I go to high holiday services, and I'm not always feeling holy, right? But I know that when I do small acts of kindness, and I have a good day, when I hold open the door, or when I've been kind as much as I can, I feel more holy in that than I do necessarily showing up to.
So you have just beautifully explicated the position, the prophetic position, as expressed in contemporary terms. So this is what I was talking about with Richard, is I think that when you said that words and prayer have replaced the rigidity of the ritual of the priestly worldview, I see what Rick is saying as a critique of the new priesthood. Mm-hmm. Right? That you have to daven a certain way at a certain time, and you have to light Shabbos candles at exactly the right time, or else it's not real, it's not legitimate, and it is not connected to Kedusha. And I think that impulse has remained, even though the rabbis were originally the biggest critics of such a thing. Right. In some ways, right, this becomes a real issue, which we studied from the Institute of Jewish Spirituality for this week. What we were, as rabbis, called into to talking about as we studied a text about this was, you can follow the letter of halacha, the letter of Jewish law, and be a terrible person. If you, and
I just want to interject one more thing on that, because in some ways, the ritual for me is a reminder, not a replacement. So I don't want to say that, when we do light Shabbos candles, okay, or when I do pray, or when I do that it isn't a holy moment, or I don't stop and think of that. But for me, it's not. For some people, I think it becomes a replacement, not a reminder.
That's right. And what I'm saying is, you don't even have to go to ritual for there to be a replacement. That's my point. You can say, this chicken is so kosher, and then you sit down to a meal and you're a glutton, and then go puke it up so you can eat some more. Like, okay, so the chicken's kosher, but your behavior with that chicken is not expressive of Kedusha, right? Of holiness. So I guess all I'm saying is, it's a tension that remains. The, kind of rigid, here's how we do things, we systematize it, we stay within that. And this other aspect, which is, but what am I cultivating in my life, in myself, in terms of character, in terms of holiness of being in the world, and the way I am with people, and what I do with the material universe? That is more important than any systematized understanding of this is how you live, a Jewish life, a holy life, observant life.
So to bring it back to what Mickey mentioned earlier about Micah. The problem for some is that they are now walking arrogantly with their God rather than humbly with their God. In the sense that,
very well said.
In other words, they have the arrogance to think that their way is the only way.
And I'm fine as long as I stay within these very strict halachic parameters. I can do what I want, right? And that is, the prophets are saying that slippery awfulness of a slope, right, is always with us. And I believe that's true, that this tension, always remains. Of course we want ritual. Of course we want, some kind of understanding of their rules and boundaries. Of course. If that becomes the point, we have lost the connection to the point of Kedusha. And I think that is what we see happening with the Holiness Code, is an evolution in Jewish thought around the purpose of Kedusha. At one point it was to protect us, we didn't get kicked off the land, right? Just keep everything going so that, it's copacetic and we're not attacked by an enemy and our children aren't carried off as slaves, right? And that's all good, that's all fine. There's an evolution that we see with the development of the Holiness Code that says, but that's not the only point anymore of pursuing Kedusha. It should be to build a model society and model relationships. Then Kedusha has a relevance, right? And a purpose and affects things in our lives versus it's there, we mitigate it, it's in the walls, we turn on the switch, the right things connect and light comes on. Right? That there's more that Kedusha can do and achieve in our world.
Did the prophets have any sort of a universalistic impulse?
Very interesting that you ask. There seems to be evidence that yes, there was an impulse within the prophets to serve as a light unto the nations, and that Bayom Hahu Yiyeh Adonai Echad Ushmo Echad. What's that from? Aleinu. That's how we finish the last prayer, other than Kaddish. The last piece of the liturgy for every service is, the last line is, Bayom Hahu, Bayom Hahu. On that day, there will be one God, and God's name will be one. Meaning, everybody will acknowledge that Yud He Vav He is God, and will call God Yud He Vav He. There was a universalistic, English sometimes is the hardest language, universalistic impulse that we then got very embarrassed by and backed way off of.
Right, because prior to the prophets, it seems there's really no attention being paid to what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, okay, you guys are the Israelites. This is how I want you to behave. And don't worry about what the Egyptians do. Don't worry about what the Babylonians do. Don't worry about what the Sumerians do. They're
just don't be like them.
Own. Just don't be like them.
Right?
Right? And yet now, when the prophets come along, or where they begin to sort of influence some of what we read in Torah, they're sort of like, well, this is how you should behave, because this is the right way for people to behave with each other, and it doesn't matter if you're a Jew talking to a Jew, or a Jew talking to a non-Jew, or a non-Jew talking to a non-Jew.
Right. In later evolutions and progressions of thought, absolutely, that seems to be where they went, and then we way backed off it when
Christianity came.
You better believe it. So it's an interesting concept, right? Because we tend to think of ourselves as we've never cared what anybody else does. We're us. We just do what we want. But every time you bring light unto the nations into it, which we love to do, when we're talking about how wonderful Judaism is, we are light unto the goyim. But the minute you say that, you're quoting texts that say, then they're supposed to follow our example. Then they're supposed to do what we do, right? And do it the way we do it. And, right, so, alright. So, the other thing that we see here is the evolution of the idea coming onto the scene and entering into our tradition very early here. Well, actually, there's an argument for an early P and an argument for a late P, but we won't go there. So but earlier than we tend to think of it is this idea that moves from Kedusha being represented in time by Shabbat, by Chagim, by holidays, and by ritual that was prescribed each day or on the occasion that you messed up or you made a promise or whatever, and so you brought your offerings. That's kind of where Kedusha entered the life of an Israelite. With the holiness code, we really see very, very well developed here the idea that Kedusha is about daily life. It's about, daily interaction. It's about every single Israelite interacting with the world. Kedusha for us as a people this early is not about retreat from the world. That is not a Jewish impulse. This early, Kedusha, holiness, is about engaging with the world and doing so in a way that is expressive of godliness.
When you say this early, give us a time frame.
Right, so it depends when you think P, right, is writing. So, but a lot of people, and the early prophets predate some of this material, right? So it's kind of messy. The dating is very messy.
Okay, so I want to reverse myself quickly.
Excellent. That is the best thing
because
in a Torah study class.
Now, as I think about it, actually the concept of sacred time and sacred space and sacred words, can act as a reminder to get you to act more holy in your daily life. So, I guess whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes, right?
Or all the above.
Right. Right. Whatever it takes is the name of the next chapter. So I'm going to hand you.
And how many pages in each?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm going to count. Now, see, I have a different one than you because yours is two-sided.
Mine is a two page.
Yes, and notice it's staggered. So they are packets that are staggered.
2 pages.
That's it. Yes. We had a disaster in here last week with the
Top two sheets.
handouts. Oy vavoy.
I'm going to,
This is
Two-sided.
two-sided.
On the other side.
On the other side, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
That's the question I should have asked much earlier.
Yes, sir.
I'm confused about this JEPD. Are these, I think there's one theory that the P, for example, represents a time when the priests were influential in what goes into the Bible.
Right.
And well, the J and the E, what was their influence? And I'm confused also about, is it the finished product that we have evolved over a period of time, and during those times there were different influences that determine what goes into this product. Is that what I'm...
All right, so let me see if I can get anywhere near what you're talking about. So you're saying P, you get it, that P is the priestly material, right? That is material that comes from the priests who ran the cult. Yes, that is what Leviticus is, right? So Leviticus is P, but P appears other places too. P, every time you see this one begat this one begat this one begat this one, that's P. In Genesis, you've got P. P is a later gloss on the Genesis material. The Genesis material comes from putting J and E together. So J is the Yahwist, so uses this name for God, right? In Latin, the Y is a J. Yes? So the Yahwist, whenever you see Yud Hey Vav Hey, it's typically a J source. When God is called Elohim, it's the Elohist. It's E. So our earliest sources are J and E that are put together because Israel begins as a very loose confederation of tribes that comes together only in the time of emergency, under a judge. The book Judges is earlier, is very early. So they would come together under national emergency, under a judge, a charismatic military leader who had some seichel, also, and would rise as a leader, bringing everybody together. But then they would go their different ways. So you had tribes in the north and tribes in the south, right? Think about Israel. It's long and narrow. Northern tribes and southern tribes. E is north, J is south. When you bring these people together and you say, here, new nation of Israel is your history book, for all of your young students now to study Israelite history, you better have the War of Northern Aggression written there, as well as the war against slavery. You have to have both terms, or half the nation is not buying your history book. So J and E are put together as the national backdrop to the story, taking all those stories from the region and putting them together in a way that can bring these people together as one people. It's when it's becoming a nation, when Israel's becoming a nation state under David. Yeah?
Is that what he is?
No, no, my friend. D is the Deuteronomist. So originally there are 4 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Deuteronomy is a later source that comes to explain the exile, the first exile. So, from the end of Numbers, they chop off the death of Moses. The redactor chops off the death of Moses, and moves it to the end of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is put into the mouth of Moshe. as his farewell address. It is a later author addressing the nation of Israel who has suffered catastrophe. So does that answer some of the progression question? And this period of time, how much is this period of time?
400 or 500 years.
1,000 years.
So when was this set? When was Torah, the 5 books, set?
400, 500 BC.
When is it set in time?
When was this sort of, even though they didn't have printing presses or anything?
The final redaction?
When printed this?
So this text, this compilation would have been by the Deuteronomist. The 5 books are closed after the writing of the Deuteronomist. So, but then you have the Deuteronomist also is Deutero-Isaiah, right? It goes into the history of Joshua, right? All that is also the Deuteronomic history.
But when Ezra is reading from Torah, is Ezra reading from the final version, or is it still being written at the time of Ezra?
Ezra's reading from the redacted version, but not the full. The full canon hasn't been redacted yet.
In other words, meaning the rest of the Tanakh.
Correct.
Right, but the first 5 books
Correct.
have been redacted by the time of Ezra.
So Ezra is
post-Babylonian exile.
right. So 586 is the Babylonian exile. 586 BCE. So but the text we can imagine stays in some kind of fluidity for a while, but for the most part is that.
By 586.
So 586 is the event that the Deuteronomist is responding to. So it's later. It's
Probably around 500-ish.
Yeah.
So would this be from like 1500 BC to
2500 BCE is when those texts are first circulating,
right.
J and E.
And then they would have gone to...
Or not texts, stories.
Not 2,500.
But to the point where this is now...
2,500 years ago. Sorry, my mistake. 2,500 years ago, the J.E. stories were circulating.
That would be when this was now cast in stone, about 500.
Way later. David is 1,000 BCE.
Yeah.
Well, no, I did mean 20.
No, so starting, no,
500.
not 2,500.
2,000.
1,500.
Yeah.
If it's to 500 BCE, 1,000 years before that is 1,500 BCE.
Right. So, but the research seems to put the Iron Age stuff at 2,000 BCE.
But if the
or
stone
thereabouts.
was 1,000 years that it had written.
Because we're writing, right? So writing's different from stories.
Yeah. Right.
Telling stories.
Because Abraham would predate any of the writing. Right. Abraham would have been in the verbal stories.
Right. It would have been an oral tradition for a very long time.
But the work being done on this might have been that 1,000-year period of 1,500.
Of redacting, yeah. Of writing down and editing. All right. Thank you, Ruben, for taking us
I really appreciate that.
into an interesting discussion.
Rabbi,
Sir.
Didn't the priests really understand that this repetition, these exquisite laws and procedures are needed by a people to create a constancy of behavior, that human beings without daily repetition and thought will not behave the way the prophets would like them to behave, even if there were no prophets?
Yes.
You need to be good, and you had to do it daily, and you had to do these rules.
Yes. So they legislate holiness. Right. Because on our own, we don't tend to make good choices.
If you move it ahead, let's say, to today, and you look at, say, the 1965 Civil Rights Act, you can look at that and say, look, this is done by the priests, because up to that point, we all don't want to discriminate, but now you really can't. You have to behave.
Right.
You've got to do this on a daily basis.
So the only friendly amendment I would make is it's the priests with a lot of influence from the critics of the priesthood.
Yeah.
You know, it seems that there was pressure on the priesthood to kind of
but the point
address these
earlier
things.
is what seems to have happened is the priests have run amok in modern Israel by glorifying procedure to the point that it really wasn't intended. It was intended to create good behavior.
That's why we have prophets, right? Because if you look at our canon, we're crazy people. We canonized our critics. Right? The prophets are not saying, Israel is a beautiful, amazing, well-behaved nation, right? Who are holy and expressive. But they're saying, y'all are messing the whole thing up. You have taken this and butchered it and twisted it and mangled it to be something you want it to be, so it works for you. That's just wrong, and that's not what God wants, and we canonize them. And those are our holy texts. You're messing it all up.
They made the rule the end result as opposed to the behavior.
Say it again.
They made the rule the end result as opposed to the behavior that the rule should encourage. I don't mean just following steps, the automaton saying do this, do this, do this. The idea of these rules is if you really think about them and you do them daily, you wake up on Tuesday morning, you say a prayer, Wednesday, Thursday, you will start to behave. You won't gossip.
Correct.
You'll behave in a better way.
Correct. That is, that is the goal, is to legislate behavior so that we actually
But it
do
does
it.
work. I mean, it can work.
Absolutely. We just probably now, as dare I say it, progressive Jews, we no longer necessarily turn to the language of legislation, right? Which is an interesting conversation. By what are we obligated to live lives expressive of holiness? It's a very interesting question for those of us who don't believe this came down on Sinai. What obligates us to act in these ways? I saw a hand.
Well, I'm taking a music class now, music composition, and there's one kind of metaphor that I think applies here, which this guy, the teacher, is looking at music as a balance between repetition on one side and variety on the other side. If you have too much repetition, the music is really boring, and you just want it to move on. And if it's on the other side of variety, there's too much chaos, there's too much change, nobody knows what's happening, nobody knows what's going to come next. So there's some kind of really beautiful balance where you're respecting, what the repetition provides, what the regularity provides, but you're also needing to have the novelty and, new, fresh ideas.
Beautifully said. For the Jewish tradition, you just explicated gorgeously the tension between keva and kavanah. Kavanah is intention, is all that fluid, you don't know what's going to happen next stuff, right? Because I could be moved to talk about who knows what next. Keva is, we go from Shema to Baruch Hu to the Amidah, right? You have fixed prayer, because if we all got together and we said, Rita Ephros is leading prayer today, no, right? It's going to be like, and then Lisa Simon's going to lead, and it's going to be, we're going to lie down on the floor and close our eyes, and we'd never know coming into the room what was going to happen, right? And that makes us really anxious. And with no structure, it all starts to be this loosey-goosey, whoever's leading. Well, that's for a lot of us not terribly helpful, right? That we need some structure and something that's familiar to us. But it's a constant, dynamic pull between keva and kavanah. Right now we're having this conversation about Friday night services here at KI. How much keva versus how much kavanah? Right? If Chaim sings a new melody every week, people can't sing along. But people are like, I'm so tired of that michamocha, I could scream. So, which is it? How do we decide? How much keva, how much kavanah? Do we put a percentage on it? Okay, 75% of the time sing something they know. But for how long? Before the Jews are like, oh my gosh, with this tune, it's killing me, right? So, It's not a small thing. It hasn't gone away. This tension remains within our tradition from, earliest times, but it is certainly still, a tension that I wish more of us were engaged in talking about, because I wish more people cared. I wish more people came and cared, but, whatever. All right. So let's look at Rabbi Lord Sachs. So the 19th chapter of Vayikra, with which our Parsha begins, is one of the supreme statements of the ethics of Torah. It's about the right, the good, and the holy, and it contains some of Judaism's greatest moral commands. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Let the stranger who lives among you be like your native born. Love that person as yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt. But the chapter is also surpassingly strange. It contains what looks like a random jumble of commands, and then we get those that we just read together, right? What have these to do with the right, the good, and the holy? To understand this, we have to engage in an enormous leap of insight into the unique moral, social, spiritual vision of the Torah, so unlike anything we find elsewhere. The West has had many attempts at defining a moral system. Some focused on rationality, others on emotions like sympathy and empathy. For some, the central principle was service to the state. For others, moral duty. For yet others, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. These are all forms of moral simplicity. Judaism insists on the opposite, moral complexity. The moral life isn't easy. Sometimes duties or loyalties clash. Sometimes reason says one thing, emotion another. More fundamentally, Judaism identified three distinct moral sensibilities, each of which has its own voice and vocabulary. They are 1, the ethics of the king, 2, the ethics of the priest, and 3, the ethics of the prophet. So we've been talking about all of this for a while, right? Go to your next page. Drop down. Priests think in terms of Torah. Prophets have the word or a vision. Elders and the wise have Eitzah, counsel. What does this mean? So then he goes through talking about the king and their courts. So kind of in that sense, that kind of wisdom that we see represented in those books. The prophetic voice is quite different. Impassioned, vivid, radical in its critique of the misuse of power and the exploitative pursuit of wealth. The prophet speaks on behalf of the people, the poor, the downtrodden, the abused. He or she thinks of the moral life in terms of relationships between God and humanity and between human beings themselves. The key terms for the prophets are tzedek, mishpat, chesed, and rachamim, which you have translated here, distributive justice, retributive justice, loving kindness, mercy, or compassion. The prophet has emotional intelligence, sympathy, and empathy, and feels the plight of the lonely and oppressed. Prophecy is never abstract. It doesn't think in terms of universals. It responds to the here and now of time and place. The priest hears the word of God for all time. The prophet hears the word of God for his or her time. So we have always prided ourselves on being, right, inheritors of this prophetic tradition. Reform Judaism really rejected a lot of the priestly stuff, right? Was very embarrassed by the priestly stuff. And it's like, get rid of it. Talit, get rid of it. It's all ancient mumbo jumbo stuff with fringes and get rid of it. Kippah, we don't cover our head in the West to show respect. We uncover the head. Get rid of kippah. So, and base themselves, if you ask classical Reform Jews what is the basis of their observance, their spiritual tradition, they would say ethical monotheism. Right? Directly from the prophets. Ethical monotheism. And I think we've been very proud of this tradition of canonizing our critics who say, you're too much about your fur coats. I'm dating myself. Your fur coats and your big hats on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur instead of what really matters. My question is, how much are we comfortable hearing from the Bima these kinds of words?
Which kinds of words?
I don't care about y'all's cars and your houses and your vacations. What have you done for the poor recently? What are we doing about those who have no shelter in our communities? What are we doing about the food insecurity? Right, so it's interesting that we pride ourselves on this, But I bet not a lot of folk would want to hear what these prophets have to say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
You know what? I mean,
Yeah?
a rabbi can be two seats. They can be comforting and they can be challenging.
So, Pam, what were you going to say?
That I think part of your job is to lead us, and part of the reason why certainly we go on the high holidays is I don't want to just hear the same old. I want someone to challenge me to be better and think about ways I could do that. I think that's a very important part of the holiday. You know, it's like challenge me. Yeah.
David?
You look for a new job, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying. Just feeling it out. Right?
The problem when you talk about a Yom Kippur or a sermon is that people coming in will hear that and they can't quite relate how that's going to benefit their life in terms of making them feel better. They just hear criticism coming out saying, you should do, you should do, you should do. But not the context we're putting into this right now. If you'd sat in this room and then had a sermon like that, you'd feel very differently about it.
So I think you're absolutely correct. I think, and I would always say we should do. And I think you're right. I think it's a very interesting time that we live in, right? That I think what Pam is saying is true, and Rick's point is true, that it's both. And I find it very interesting at our high holidays now. As an affluent community, people want to come in and they want to be inspired and they want to leave feeling good. And so I hear a lot. People don't want to, when I first got here, they were like, whoa, what is she doing? What is she doing? What is she talking about? And I got a lot of feedback that knock that off. That's, that I was, that about Yom Kippur is about deprivation, so that we feel what the hungry feel. That Yom Kippur is about getting it, that life is short and we're not going to be here very long and we can mess this up or we can do really great things, but we're supposed to feel it today. We're supposed to hurt today. You hungry? Good. Right? And that there's a message there that's like, whoa.
Tell me why that's right. Don't just tell me. Tell me why.
Because we're supposed to feel it.
I'm supposed to. Tell me why I'm going to benefit from that work.
See, you're not. That's the point. It's not about you.
I am, because I'm going to change my behavior.
So
I'm not going to take it for granted.
So when you say, how's it going to help me? I feel like that's the tension in American Judaism right now, is what can American Judaism do for me? Rather than, I really am ready to come to the American Jewish table and be challenged by our critics that we say are our holy text. But how comfortable really are we with being, and I include myself in this, I'm not putting me on one side of this and anybody else on the other. I'm saying we as American Jews, I'm not sure how comfortable we are now with really the critique of the prophets.
It's not just American Jews. I think generally people in modern society, commitment
secularists
and giving without receiving, not really being on the...
Which is a new situation for Jews.
Yeah.
This is a new situation that Jews have the same rights and responsibilities as every other citizen. This is new. And so the benefits are obvious. The costs, I guess, are what I'm lifting up. Because you're right, commitment, where is that? Where do we, and this goes back to that thing of, if we don't believe in an obligating voice from, then what obligates us to this, right?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's back to the all or nothing. I mean, so if you were talking about in those first couple sermons you gave, when you were really talking about the ritualistic, deep, dark feeling of Yom Kippur, I dress in white because you should feel death and all that. That may have been some stylistic stuff that people may have given you feedback. I don't think that means that people don't want to come to high holidays and be challenged. The other thing is that you're given, if we're talking about morality here, I mean, Rabbi Sachs, and we're talking about there's 3 different tools in your belt. Because it's not just the prophetic, it is the kings and the judges, and the priests. And to, in some ways, the prophetic piece is the feeling piece, right? It's the progressive worldview today piece. And the conservative worldview is, it's not how you feel. If it feels good to do it, does it work? Is it right? Right? And the priestly piece is that, we need to have order and chaos. And after 9/11, and after Paris gets blown up, people do want to come and be comforted too. So I would just argue that you're given 3 tools in your belt here, and use them. And I would think that I'd be disappointed if our congregation, if our members said, you know what, we just want to come in, we just want to be comforted. We don't want to be challenged. We don't want to be forced to think. We don't want to be forced to be introspective. That's not why I'm here. I just want to hear the songs, right? Hear something funny. Let's get Stephen back to tell some jokes. He was great at that, and that's
Well, I think what you're hearing from me is a sort of existential concern for our people's relationship to our own self-criticism being a massively important part of our tradition. I think that's what I'm expressing. I think is some concern about how seriously, we take.
That's what I meant about. I think I didn't say it the right way, but I said, tell me why I should feel this way. I really want to know because I want to lead a better life. Mm-hmm. But if you just tell me do that, you haven't connected the dots.
So, but what I hear you saying is a starting place that I'm worried about. Right. I'm worried about people starting from a place of I want to live a better life, and I'm ready to face what that means and to do what's needed to be done, and I feel obligated to do that. That's where I'm very worried about.
Tell me why.
Right. But I hear for you that why is satisfying. I'm not sure people are starting there. There are too many folks who are not starting with the whys because I want to be better and do what that's going to require.
I've never been told that. I mean, today's June.
What? Well, then I'm not doing my job very well. All right. What? We're gonna need to close because I know people have to go. So I'm gonna close with the words of Rabbi Nina Mizrahi. Kedoshim. You don't have it. Kedoshim, you shall be holy. You are immersed in holiness, surrounded and saturated with life, an infinity pool, with sparks of holiness dancing in the air we breathe, seeds of holiness sprouting from the land upon which we walk, enriching our food with spiritual sustenance, transforming what Buber called I-it into I-thou, raising up holiness, that we may resurrect life in others, or even save ourselves. There need be no unemployment when it comes to the sacred work of arousing, nurturing, and embracing holiness. There is only free choice, finding the will to live by its code of mindful and meaningful living. Holiness thrives in the relationships we create. It is nourished by loving and pursuing peace, by choosing to be part of a community, by honoring the worth of every being. It matters not how one understands or names the source of this holiness, or that all share the same belief, unbelief, or non-belief. Most crucial is that we recognize how dark, small, and seemingly purposeless our world becomes without the mooring of relationships. Accepting that each of us is immersed in holiness, saturated with life, choosing not to flow aimlessly, we can buoy ourselves with acts of kindness, compassion, and love. Build docks through each act of social justice. Launch lifeboats to all in need of rescue. Call out for help when we find ourselves sinking, burdened by the heavy weights of isolation, illness, and the holiness code. Whatever your metaphor, is a gift for all to raise ourselves up, revealing the noblest traits, ethics, and values that shape a fulfilling, purposeful life. Shabbat Shalom.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday morning Torah study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.